So if you've made it this far into this lesson, kudos. This is a tough one, and it makes sense. We are rapidly approaching views in the 20th and 21st century, and this, of course, is an era of specialization, and, these kind of views, very few people even talk about them, right? It usually requires that you reach a graduate level course in something like philosophy or maybe a nearby discipline like cognitive science. And that's when you can talk about these. So we are really getting into difficult territory. Here is the one connection that I can make for you with the theories that we're covering today and the views that we've been covering so far. So here's what we can for sure say. There is a link between David Hume and Adam Smith's work and the views we're covering today. So we can say that the Hume and Smith are like the grandparents of these views. So let's think about them that way. One view that we're covering is non-cognitivism. Now, there is a more technical definition that you can find in the text, but put simply, moral judgments aren't what you think they are. They're not propositions, but emotive expressions. So that is one interpretation, a modern interpretation of what Hume and Smith were saying. Of course, you can still be a moral sentimentalist, right? That's a first order position. But this is going further. It's saying, do you want to know what the linguistic function of making a moral judgment really is? You're not really expressing a belief. You're just saying how you feel. That's non-cognitivism. Moral error theory says something like this. Even if moral judgments were a proposition, they would be false, since moral properties don't seem like the kind of thing that actually exists. If moral properties were real, they would be so strange. What are the odds they actually exist? Some non-physical, timeless thing? How would we even know they exist? That's the moral error theorists. They just go ahead and say they don't exist. Sorry. Justification skepticism. Even if moral properties did exist, the odds that evolution gave you an adequate cognitive system to actually grasp moral truth is highly unlikely. So justification skepticism is the epistemic position. You can't know they exist. Whereas moral error theory is the metaphysical position, basically saying, it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that can exist. So that's how you can kind of separate those two second ones. And non-cognitivism is a position about linguistic functions. So those are the three right there. To subscribe to any one of these views is to subscribe to moral skepticism, the view that moral truth is impossible to acquire. And as a little exercise, you can go back to the previous slide and basically just see how each one of them, in their own special way, denies that moral truth is possible. By the way, per Joyce, 2016, the highest degree of moral skepticism, sort of a black belt of moral skepticism, is to subscribe to all three: non-cognitivism, moral error theory, and justification skepticism. That's what he argues for in his essays in moral skepticism. So moral skepticism is not very popular in philosophy. Only about 28% of philosophers hold the view, according to a relatively recent survey now. But it is popular in other fields. For example, Yuval Noah Harari, who is the author of many books, assumes something like moral skepticism. He doesn't call it that, but it's something like it. And he does so basically without any defense. Here is a nice long quote showing you what seems to be atheism about morality, essentially. So here is a quote from Harari. Sapiens rule the world because only they can weave an intersubjective web of meaning, a web of laws, forces, entities, and places that exist purely in their common imagination. This web allows humans alone to organize crusades, socialist revolutions, and human rights movements. The humanities, in contrast, emphasize the crucial importance of intersubjective entities, which cannot be reduced to hormones and neurons. Here he is juxtaposing with the hard sciences. To think historically means to ascribe real power to the contents of our imaginary stories. Of course, historians don't ignore objective factors such as climate change and genetic mutations, but they give much greater importance to the stories people invent and believe. So clearly, I've added some emphasis there, even in my reading of the quote. But clearly, he doesn't think that some of our laws that we make, including moral laws, are real in an objective sense. They're more so a social construction. Now, of course, I can't go into Harari's work or the role of the humanities or any of that. Here's what I want to focus on for a second, and then we'll move on to the main point of this video. What I want to say first, though, is that all of this whole discussion is only possible after Kant and after Darwin. We needed both of them. So, picture this if you will. We have one account, which we're studying today. Let's call it moral skepticism to kind of, black belt moral skepticism, right? All three versions or flavors of being a moral skeptic rolled into one. So we have that view on the one end of the spectrum. And on the other end, we have some radical alternative. The view that moral law is real. We can access it. It existed before humans were around. It is a command from law, or from reason itself, right? So the Kantian position is the absolute other extreme. So on the one hand, some argue that moral judgments are objectively true. Moral properties are realer than real, and the moral law must be obeyed regardless of context, culture, religion. The best example, and as we learned from MacIntyre, the person who basically set the standard is Immanuel Kant. On the other hand, some argue that morality is a product of our cognitive processes, which themselves are the product of the blind, purposeless, cosmic process of natural selection, an adaptation built on other adaptations. When put that way, when we add that it is a blind, purposeless process, you really see how moral skepticism, as fueled by moral sentimentalism, is a very deflationary view. It takes out all the air out of morality, basically. So Kant, fluffs it up as much as possible, and the moral skeptics take out all the air. There's nothing there, only a shell is left. So this is kind of the general spectrum, the two ends of the spectrum: an absolutist moral realism and a deflationary moral skepticism. Now, if we had time or some coffee, I would explain to you why I think these are the two most likely positions. There are intermediate positions. It seems like virtue theory is somewhere in the middle, right? It's not absolutist, at least not originally. And Alistair MacIntyre would argue as much. It also seems like cultural relativism is somewhere in the middle, although I think that view has its own problems that it never really dealt with. But I'm not going to focus on that right now. What instead I want to talk about is this. It's a little bit of food for thought. And since we are covering moral skepticism today, let me just paint a picture for you. Maybe it happened like this. So far back in the evolutionary history of life, some animals developed individual intentionality. They could cognitively represent experiences, they could make inferences and transform these representations, and they acquired the ability to self-monitor and make thoughtful behavior decisions. Lots and lots and lots of animals far back in evolutionary history have this, right? So this is not a human thing. This goes back to, basically the first animals on the planet. that had some kind of, I don't want to call it agency, but they could represent experiences to themselves. So that is very, very far back in evolutionary history. Let's move a little farther forward. Haidt reminds us that Darwinian processes have produced ultra-social creatures on at least 4 occasions. Maybe there's more, but let's focus on these. Hymenoptera, ants, bees, wasps, termites, naked mole rats, and of course, humans. Non-human ultra-social species cooperate due to the genetics of kin altruism, an evolutionary strategy that favors the reproductive success of one's relatives. So these here disgusting termites, they're all siblings, right? That's why they help each other out. In these creatures, the foundation of their ultra-social cooperation is that they are all siblings. Here are some mole rats equally hideous in my estimation. For example, some ants spend their lives hanging from the top of a tunnel, offering their abdomens as food storage bags for the rest of the nest. Something really only a sister or brother could do for, their siblings. So that is another example of an ultra-social species. This ultra-sociality bred ultra-cooperation, which is what enables the massive division of labor seen in these species. Yes, ants go to war, they engage in agriculture, they do all kinds of, they go hunting, they do all kinds of things that require a strong division of labor, all basically without minds, and it's all essentially just instinctual. I mean, there's just a mechanical way that they do this. And this is all enabled by the fact that, they work cooperatively because they're all related. So that, of course, is not the case with humans because we are not all related. So we can't fully explain why humans behave the way they do just through kin altruism. So, somewhere along the way, animals acquired another adaptation that enables cooperation, one which was first introduced by Trivers. That's called reciprocal altruism. This is a tendency to help another individual at a cost if there is a chance that this individual might be able to return the favor at a later date. Something like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So this still, however, doesn't explain the degree of cooperation that we engage in. Because we help people out sometimes, even when there is no rational expectation of getting the favor returned later on. I mean, in certain studies, I'm thinking here of Milgram in particular, who's mostly known for shocking people, literally. But he also did some other things where, for example, he found that people tipped, even at a restaurant, even when they're not from that town and they're never going to see them ever again, right? So there's all these little tendencies that can't be explained either by kin altruism or by reciprocal altruism, and so we have to keep going. Humans have all these and go further still. Tomasello and colleagues hypothesizes that around 2 million years ago, soon after the emergence of the genus Homo, there evolved the capacity for cooperative communication, which he calls joint intentionality, not found in great apes. So we do have some nice extra features. And then, beginning around 100,000 years ago, humans began to develop the capacity for symbolic representation, more features that we have that, well, no other living species have it to the degree that we have it, which itself required some new cognitive mechanisms. So you can check out Tomasello's own work, but also von Petzinger, who studies cave art and has her very interesting theory. She actually pushes it back to 120,000 years, so you can check out her book for that. This culminated in the so-called cognitive revolution, which only appears like a real revolution if you ignore the evidence of cognitive mechanisms bootstrapping themselves to improve generation after generation. So there is a criticism of the label cognitive revolution, and it's because it just seems fast from our vantage point, but really there's a nice rationale for it. So here is a summary from a cognitive scientist named Andy Clark. Once the process of cultural and technological evolution is underway, the explanation of our contemporary human achievements lies largely in a kind of iterated bootstrapping in which brains and first-generation cognitive technologies cooperate so as to design and create the new, enriched technological environments in which new brains and second-generation cognitive technologies again conspire, producing the third-generation environment for another set of brains to learn in, and so on. In other words, you and I develop with our brains and our cognitive tools some nice, let's call it a culture, some cultural norms. And that culture advances. And so we're able to teach the next generation, our children, an even more advanced one. And they get to build off that. So they get to teach our grandchildren an even more advanced set of tools. Further and further down the line, we have what looks like a cognitive revolution, but really it can all be explained very easily through some kind of, he calls it iterated bootstrapping. So that kind of, I think it's a nice label for it. Anyway, finally, humans acquired collective intentionality, the capacity for robust culture and transmission of values before we migrated out of Africa. So very interesting here, it's not one module or capacity or function that we acquired. We kept getting a series of capacities, and only all of these in combination might be what allows us to transmit values in the way that we do. So what gave rise to collective intentionality? Well, no one knows, to be honest. But perhaps a clue to the first question, this question that I just asked, can be found in the anthropological record, in particular in scenarios where there were new environmental challenges that sapiens had to face and adapt to. Take as one example the supervolcano that erupted a few thousand years before Homo sapiens are said to have attempted their second emigration out of Africa. So remember, the first time they tried to emigrate, they were fought back by Neanderthals, among others, but the second time they were successful. Why were they successful? Well, they had collective intentionality, probably, by then. But why do they get collective intentionality? That's the question I'm talking about here. Here's just a possibility. Approximately 75,000 years ago, a volcano erupted in Toba, Indonesia, spewing vast volumes of fine ash and aerosols into the atmosphere with effects comparable to nuclear winter scenarios. The human population appears to have gone through a bottleneck at this time, according to some estimates dropping as low as approximately 500 reproducing females in a world population of approximately 4,000 individuals. That's very few people. That seems like a lot of selection pressure. So maybe it was around this time that we began to acquire collective intentionality. Who knows? Obviously, that's very speculative. But the point is, somehow, humans acquired the capacity for shared meaning, but importantly, it's a common imagination that felt real. It feels real, right? That's what the moral skeptics are always stressing. Okay, we're not done yet. This is why this lesson is called Endless Night. Why did sapiens settle starting around 50,000 years ago? Remember, we were nomads for a very long time, and then we settled into states. Well, what slowly turned into states. Well, Dartnell has a theory. He argues that perhaps the naturally occurring cyclical rapid warming and cooling of the planet may have been the cause of settled societies. Here's one possible scenario. During a period of stasis, during a cool period to be particular, some societies had plenty available to them, and so they settled. They just simply decided to, experiment with agriculture, just hang out. It seems to be nice and stable. Let's give it a whirl. But then as the cool cycle ended, the areas that had been populated began to desertify, right? So everything gets warm, especially around the equator. Those regions become deserts, and now you can't grow crops. This might have been what happened in, for example, ancient Egypt. And then large numbers of climate refugees crowded the Nile Valley regions. So now everyone's crowding, and we have a different kind of problem. Not only do we have no food, but now we have an abundance of people fighting for the little that is around. Centralized bureaucracies were the only structures that could coordinate agricultural practices, and they thereby gained legitimacy. Armies were organized to protect raiders from raiders, and thus generals were born, followed by empire. So bureaucracy began essentially because they needed them. So maybe here is a little bit of support for Hobbes, although not the kind of support that Hobbes was probably expecting. But it doesn't end there. We need to talk about the language that we use when we talk about morality. So we turn to the work of David Anthony, and it turns out that around 5000 BCE, a new set of values was arising in the Pontic region. It involved the domestication of the horse, the normalization of inequality in nomadic society, and the language known as Proto-Indo-European. Now, to be honest, I can't really get into this, but it is a fascinating story. Here's what I can say. There were two sets of values, essentially. The inequality that these nomadic horse archers were developing, and kind of more egalitarian approaches. So these two sets of values were to converge in the millennia-long struggle between nomadic horse archer raiders, and settled and semi-settled peoples, a war that caused both sides to scale up in civilizational complexity with greater divisions of labor and ever-improving military technology. So in this part of Eurasia, there were some nomadic horse archers and there were some settled people, and they just kept fighting, but their continual fighting required each side to really improve not only their own military technology, but the division of labor in their society. And this happens all the time. For the Romans, they caused what is called secondary state formation, where the surrounding nomadic peoples sort of became more civilizationally complex, almost by osmosis, by being in constant contact with the Romans. So this happened between the horse archers and the settled and semi-settled people in Eurasia. But here is where this is relevant to our story. After this convergence, evaluative language stabilized to refer primarily to noble people and their practices. What does this mean? These horse archers spoke a language called Proto-Indo-European, and they had a language for values, right? Evaluative language, like moral terms, and this stabilized after this long warring period. And what this evaluative language referred to was noble people. This language, Proto-Indo-European, is one of the things that it fragmented into is Greek. So it is from Proto-Indo-European, probably, that the Greek got some of its words for moral terms. So now we go into things we've already covered. MacIntyre gives a history of the Greek word agathos, which is the ancestor of a word good. Now, agathos in Greek very likely came is a descendant of Proto-Indo-European, which is what the nomadic horse archers spoke. In Homeric times, the word agathos was used to describe noblemen. Oh, surprise, surprise. Who were successful in battle and in ruling. It's also implied that they had the wealth and status to be able to train to be successful in battle and in ruling. So good in these days just meant the noble. MacIntyre notes that the attribution of agathos is inextricably linked to the descriptive. success in battle, wealth, etc. So it isn't moral, it is descriptive. Agathos does not conform to Kant's maxim that ought implies can, because there is no ought in Homer's agathos. The same is true for arete. Arete is attributed when one excels at their socially allotted function. So this Kantian conception of morality, this absolutist position, this realist position, it just wasn't a thing in ancient Greece. That's not how people used the words. It had to do with social success. As Greek society came into contact with other peoples whose customs were radically different, for example, through war with the Persians, or as the Greeks colonized other peoples, etc., Greeks began to consider the distinction between nomos, those mores that had been established merely through convention and custom, and physis, the universal realm of nature. So they were wondering, okay, so what are just like cultural customs, and what are things that everyone should do? Greeks began to think about this, especially the Athenians, as they engage with trade or warfare with other people and saw different ways of life, different social orders. And now they began to wonder. By this point, if one were to, say, relocate, because you could, one would have to figure out what new moray one must follow as part of a new city's culture, what nomos you have to follow now, and what is universally required of everyone, physis. And so the meanings of agathos and arete became divorced from their noble origins. This is when it happened. And disagreements arose as to how they should be interpreted. This disagreement in turn created a demand for clarification, a role which the sophists and later philosophers eagerly filled. So it was when people began to come into contact with different social orders, when these Greeks began to come into contact with different social orders, that they realized, well, we got to distinguish what we should always do and those things that are only done because of a particular culture. And these debates, philosophical debates, started. Think of Unit 2, and this is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. Concurrently, at the same time that all this was happening, big gods were being invented. Now, this is obviously the atheistic position, but big gods were being invented via cultural evolution during the Axial Age, and humans became even more cooperative. This might have been part of the reason why human complexity increased yet again, so we know that there is a correlation here, although we haven't established causation. But also, the invention of big gods probably complicated explanations about the meanings of agathos and arete. It's not just, what kind of virtues make you successful in a given social order. Now it's like, oh, which god is the right god? And then the conversations got even more difficult. Which, again, if you want to know about these debates, this kind of endless debating, take a look at Unit 2. But of course, that was several thousand years ago, and we have just kept on chugging along. In Chapter 4 of Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker surveys a catalog of horrors: human sacrifice, torture, wars of religion, witch burning, and then he points out that these are all now, by and large, considered inhumane. He then makes his case as to what led to this moral progress. So those things are all pretty much gone, and that's, it's hard to say that's not a nice thing. Why did it go away? Why did we stop doing this to each other? Well, here's what Pinker says. I'm prepared to take this line of explanation a step further. The reason so many violent institutions succumbed within so short a span of time was that the arguments that slew them belonged to a coherent philosophy that emerged during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. The ideas of thinkers like Hobbes, Spinoza, Descartes, Locke, David Hume, Mariasto, Kant, Beccaria, Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, and John Stuart Mill coalesce into a worldview that we can call Enlightenment humanism. It is also sometimes called classical liberalism. Now, I took the liberty to put in bold all the people we're going to cover in this course. So, maybe Pinker has a good point, and the skeptics can use this. We just continually took the language of values and became more inclusive, expanded the net of the moral community so it can include more people. We also started using governments more so as instruments of social organization as opposed to divine order. That's maybe as we were leaving behind things like divine command theory. And other things aided in this process of sort of moralizing or improving our society, our societies. The technology of the printed word, for example, spread literacy and proliferated the practice of regularly taking the perspective of another. In other words, empathy via the reading of novels. So of course, when you read a novel, put yourself in the position of another. David Hume and Adam Smith would be very happy with this. This allows you to empathize with the person and also allows you to practice taking the perspective of an objective observer so you can know what truly is the virtuous behavior in a particular setting. We keep going. Endless night indeed. The spread of manners led to diminished uncleanliness, which might also have facilitated respecting the dignity of others. And commerce seems to have also played an important role, since you want to look healthy and respectable to those you engage in business with. So all this is from Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, and she says we're looking at the 18th century, really. That's when these things were happening. And again, we don't stop. Now we jump forward a little bit to the 20th century, and we had all these rights revolutions, the women's rights movement, right? There's also the civil rights movement. There's also the children's rights movements. Remember, it's something like a century ago, there was still such a thing. I mean, you can just see it in this picture. There's still such a thing as child labor. Then the gay rights movement. And what we're still going through now, the animal rights movement, right? So we kept expanding the moral net. But I want you to notice something. This is all from the perspective of a moral skeptic. And remember, the moral skeptic thinks that if you go to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there is no fruit there. There is nothing there. It's all in your imagination, our imagination, a socially constructed ideology of moral values. That's what they're saying. That's what's so controversial about this view. But just the fact that it's controversial doesn't mean it's false.